So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Vitaly Chernetsky, and it's a great honor for me to be serving as the president of this association this year. Thank you for colleagues for electing me for this role. And one of the tasks of the president is to select the theme for the convention. And therefore last year, following up on the topic of decolonization proposed by the previous year's president, Professor Julia Johnson, I suggested as a logical continuation the topic of liberation. You've had, as you were preparing to the convention, the opportunity to familiarize with the reflections as to what liberation might mean, especially in academic perspectives. And this is something that we will be focusing on today. The title of our presidential plenary, and the presidential plenary is an opportunity for the president to curate a panel of speakers who could help us illuminate this year's panel. This year's topic is identifying and applying liberating perspectives in Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies. And liberating perspectives is a concept that I borrowed when writing the theme from the work of the great African writer and thinker Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And for him, a liberating perspective, identifying and practicing that is an essential part of the process of decolonization. So today we have 6 excellent speakers who represent different aspects and different areas within our diverse field, or fields in the plural. And our first speaker is Alex Agerbuch, who is an interdisciplinary scholar, poet and translator, and currently a collegiate fellow in the College of Literature, Science and the Arts, and an assistant professor of Ukrainian literature and culture in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Michigan. His research explores intercultural and trans-epochal phenomena in Eastern European and Jewish literatures and cultures from the 18th century to the present, with a special focus on Ukraine. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto, has been doing a lot of wonderful things, and he is also an acclaimed poet. His poetry collection, The Jewish King, was a finalist for the Shevchenko National Prize, Ukraine's highest awards for culture and literature. And Alex, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Vitaly. Dear colleagues, my topic today is something often dismissed as played out, something that even seems to be under attack: diversity and inclusion. These principles are widely applied across the humanities, but within our field, their realization still has a long way to go. While I will touch on a few points related to Slavic studies generally, my primary focus will be on my specific area of interest, Ukraine. Colleagues from other disciplines often see Slavic studies as monocultural, rooted in notions of romantic nationalism. The persistence of the very term Slavic in our departments seem to reinforce an ethnic exclusion, a framing that has long shaped our field. And while I often find myself reflexively defending us in this situation, there is some truth in how we are perceived. It leaves me wondering, what then should I do in my teaching, research, and public engagement? Amid ongoing debates, it's encouraging to see you, my dear colleagues, expanding Ukrainian studies beyond current trends, promoting and diversifying it in the research and teaching. New books and initiatives on Ukraine's multiculturalism keep appearing, like the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies program in Indigenous Crimean Tatar Studies, or the recent volume Minorities at War, Cultural Identity and Resilience in Ukraine. Nevertheless, cultural studies of our region remain shaped by power dynamics and by lingering colonial influences and struggles for dominance and for visibility in the shadow of that dominance. Visibility in this case is multisensory. It means seeing all possible sources and hearing all the voices, teaching diverse and inclusive materials, and addressing historical injustices. This is why the persistent limitations to primary sources in one dominant language or culture, limitations conditioned by history, politics, and demographics, call for conscious expansion. In considering practical steps I might take toward the goal of historical justice, I have conducted surveys with Crimean Tatar, Roma, Greek, and Jewish artists, voices from Ukraine's national minorities. And their insights reveal much about Ukraine's diversity and its evolving image globally. But above all, I wanted to hear how these individuals perceive their representation and the injustices they face. Diversity can be liberating, both historically and conceptually. And conceptually, in the sense of moving beyond ethnic exclusivity and embracing a broader inclusivity based on region, civic identity, and culture. And by culture, I do not mean the romanticized ethnicity-bound view thereof, a product of the imperial and Soviet legacy that still resonates in Slavic studies. Liberation here calls for rethinking the very term culture to reflect the region's dynamic multiplicities, including its various sexual identities, political ideologies, and diaspora communities. This broader understanding of diversity is especially relevant as global attention increasingly turns to Ukraine. However, even the gains made in inclusivity can still feel isolating. That is, while valuable efforts are being made to study and teach the many cultures of the region, these cultures are frequently treated as separate entities rather than integral parts of the unified whole. Returning to the survey, one central question, phrased in various ways, asked, do you feel that Ukrainian society has a sufficient awareness of your community's culture and history? And the predominant response, no, likely stems from historical and social factors, particularly the Soviet legacy, which at best include minority cultures in hegemonic and isolated ways. The current focus on Ukraine's defense and national identity, moreover, often paradoxically overshadows the evaluation of diversity. In response to the question, do you feel that the war and the participation of representatives from different nationalities contribute to better integration of these groups into the broader Ukrainian discourse? One participant replied, of course it does, with one caveat. For us, first we need to spill blood on the battlefield to earn that recognition and integration. It's not provided automatically. Another set of questions asked respondents about their recognition as Ukrainians internationally. In your opinion, is the global community aware of Ukraine's multicultural heritage and contemporary diversity? Are your communities represented in projects like anthologies or festivals? And responses indicated that while some representation exists, it remains limited. Global awareness of these communities and of cultural products in languages other than Ukrainian or Russian is still insufficient. And the mention of Ukrainian and Russian together highlights that for some, both languages exert a similar predominance, which is felt by the national minorities of Ukraine. And this feedback suggests ways in which I, as educator and advocate of Ukrainian culture, can help shift the alternative. For example, after reviewing over a dozen recent anthologies of contemporary Ukrainian literature, mainly poetry in translation to various languages, I found that while these collections are often used in our courses, and many of us have contributed to them as compilers or translators, not a single Roma, Crimean Tatar, or Greek author was included, yet almost every anthology included a translation from the Russian. An interesting tendency emerged during my survey and follow-up interviews. While there is a gradual shift toward Ukrainian among authors who have previously written in other languages, especially in Russian,
Representatives of minority communities often take deliberate steps to fight homogenization and emphasize their cultural individuality and visibility. For instance, one young Tauro-Romaic poet explained Azov Greeks' aspiration to switch from using the Cyrillic to the Greek alphabet as an effort to assert the community's presence. As an example of the marginalization of minorities in Ukraine-related publishing, one respondent noted that while anthologies dedicated to Crimean Tatar literature exist, they are seen as ethno-national preserves. The Crimean Tatar community has never been invited to contribute to pan-Ukrainian collections, and this situation reinforces separation rather than inclusion. By isolating minority voices into exclusive collections, these anthologies, whether intentionally or not, suggest that these voices are peripheral. Another set of questions focused on how cultural institutions and events abroad acknowledge Ukraine's multiculturalism. One respondent shared, "I have visited numerous Ukrainian academic and public institutions in the diaspora. I have never encountered any mention of Ukraine's Roma heritage, let alone a celebration of our national holiday on April 8. I'm skeptical if anyone in these institutions even knows about this holiday." Another respondent voiced a similar skepticism. "I know that in Western institutions, you teach about the Vyshivanka and Pisanka, and maybe one day you will mention our Meitan or Sherbenti." And this response highlights the focus on dominant cultural symbols to the neglect of cultural elements of other Ukrainian communities, in effect treating them as if they were not Ukrainian. This imbalance in recognition persists even after death, as those acknowledged in life remain in collective memory. Heartbroken, we hear of many outstanding Ukrainian artists and authors killed by Russia. Some are commemorated widely, yet others go unknown. And I would like to dedicate these final words to the barely recognized passing of a Greek Ukrainian poet, Natalia Kharakos, who perished at the age of 86 in a basement in Mariupol after her apartment building was destroyed, though she miraculously survived the initial strike. The image of her building's destruction became known worldwide, but Natalia, an iconic voice in Greek Ukrainian poetry, did not. May her memory and that of others whose legacy is shadowed by oblivion be a blessing. My comments today are not meant to undervalue the efforts of my esteemed colleagues who inspire my work, but rather to address matters I feel personally responsible for. I've started reading, translating, and engaging with voices I hadn't focused on before. And these conversations and interviews inspired me to translate poetry created in Crimean Tatar, Romani, and Tauro-Romaic languages, works that are both beautiful and deserve to be explored and taught. My course, Cultures of Ukraine, explores languages, literatures, nationalities, and religions alongside such other culture shaping facets as sexual identities, political ideologies, underground movements, subcultures in the temporary occupied territories, and diaspora communities. I love Ukraine so much, and I promote it academically and publicly, but my love is not blind. I strive to get students and readers to see its complexities, its struggles, debates, vibrancy, and imperfections, all the things that make it not idealized, but real. Grateful to be on this journey with you, my dear colleagues.
Our next speaker is Dragan Kojundžić, who is a professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Florida, with teaching affiliations also in Film and Media Studies, Germanic and Slavic Studies, European Studies, and Religion. Apart from numerous edited volumes on Bakhtin, Derrida, and J. Hillis Miller, and documentary films, including on Alexander Sakurov, he includes several monographs and films So a very prolific and distinguished career in many different areas. He is currently editing a volume on Ukraine and Jews. Dragan, please.
My paper for the presidential panel has a title, Russia, an Axe to Grind. It is very late, too late for many who will not see another day. Thrown into the meat grinder of the war against Ukraine, into that ideological void opened a long time ago by Russian nihilism, a symptom of an identity crisis Russia has been trying to fill from the very inception of its entry to modernity in the early 18th century. As soon as Russia encountered the West, it opened an identitarian wound, forever oscillating between its own lagging behind Europe and attempts to compensate for that delay by messianic nationalist acceleration, be it in its religious or communist guise. That split was eminently marked in an emblematic, metaphorical way by Raskolnikov's axe, splitting the culture in half, but was recently given a modern-day literal instantiation by another denizen of St. Petersburg, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and his Kuvalda, with which he smashed the brains of his political opponents and Ukrainian war prisoners. All available on YouTube. This process has now entered its terminal stage, literally and figuratively, under the name of Russism, Russian fascism. In the name of Russia, 1,500 bodies are now thrown into the maw of that sovereignist compensation daily. This process is, and that is only on the Russian side, not counting the numerous Ukrainian civilians, which bothers me much more, intentionally killed in schools, hospitals, their place of work, thousands of children deported from Ukraine to Russia, in itself a genocide by the Geneva Convention and international laws. In the name of Russia, Russian idea, language, literature, and culture, in the name of all of these bodies of tradition and knowledge, which constitute our own discipline, Russians are bombing Kiev. I will take the liberty to quote from my essay, After Russian Post-Colonial Identity, published in Modern Language Notes a quarter of a century ago, in order to give a brief genealogy of the ideological premises which energize this aggressivity. Vladimir Solovyov, in his Russian Idea, published in 1888, concludes that, I quote Solovyov, the Russian Empire, which would want to serve the universal church and the deed of social organization, will bring to the family of peoples of the world peace and blessing by taking them under its protection. End of quote from Solovyov. And I continued. Solovyov, of course, does not ask whether peoples of the world would want to be submitted to Russia's blessing or the peaceful protection of the Russian Empire. His is the colonial gesture which unfolds within Russian history as the colonization of others. And now I'll conclude the quote from my essay. One aspect of Slavic studies which stems from out of this historical predicament is that most Slavic departments in the US are configured as, in fact, Russian departments, mini empires. Other Slavic programs and disciplines are taken under its protection, often given only perfunctory representation and only introductory language instruction, as opposed to a full-fledged Russian syllabus in literary theory, culture, or arts at all undergraduate and graduate levels. The war of Russian aggression on another Slavic country gives additional impetus to think the links they entertain in American academia. This premise requires reconfiguration of departments from within to affect the politics of staffing, hiring, and the cultivation of the Slavic disciplines other than Russian to the point where we might equally imagine a department in which 1 of 8 professors would teach Russian and 7 others South Slavic modernism, the Muslim cultures in the Balkans and the Caucasus, including also Roma, diasporic culture, Bulgarian Slavic literacy, Polish literature, Ukrainian Jews, Prague and Kafka, and especially all those cultures in their historic interconnection and dialogue, and in the ways many of them were kept under colonial domination and cultural occupation by the Russian and Soviet empires. And the second aspect that confronts specifically and singularly Russian scholars, of which I am one. From now on, they will have to ask themselves and to justify their teaching and research by starting with the question posed by Adorno many decades ago. Is it possible to write poetry after the Holocaust? To paraphrase him slightly, how to teach and read and write about Russian literature after the genocide perpetuated in the war against Ukraine? For the radical acceleration and the violent void form of Russian nationalism in the guise of Russism brought to the fore the fact that Russia is a country which needs to work through its xenophobia but also anti-Semitism, from the protocols of the wise men of Zion to recent anti-Semitic public statements by Lavrov and Putin. The current war of aggression of Russia treats Ukraine in similar ways to the ways the Tsarist regime treated Jews. Resolving the Jewish problem required, in the words of Konstantin Pobedonostsev, to convert 1/3 of them, expelled another third, and killed the rest. This is now applied by Russism to the entire Ukraine. Thus emerges a strange Judaification of Ukraine, noted also by Jason Stanley, for example, facing nothing less than the final solution of its existence. If something gives me a glimmer of hope in the current dark hours, it is the great heroic example of Ukrainians from which I learn in awe every day. As a literary scholar, I take solace in the poetic beauty of the words Bavovna and Palyanitsa, or from the line about Ruski военный корабль, as sublime as any lyrical poem by Pushkin, an instant classic. And another reason which gives me hope and has motivated my participation today, it is the fact that under Vitaly Chernetsky, the forces of liberation have been articulated and motivated in ASEEES. His stellar scholarship on Ukrainian postmodernism, of course preceding this engagement as the president and giving a solid disciplinary foundation and reflection. I am profoundly grateful to him for inviting me and bringing me again into the ASEEES fold. Also, my hope arises from the fact that in our Slavic discipline, I discern amazing achievements and energies made visible already today in my younger colleagues. I urge you to read the work of Lisa Wakamia on Ukrainian and Jewish visual culture, Leah Feldman on Azeri culture and literature, and the Global South, a groundbreaking endeavor. Amelia Glazer and her transformation of the field of Yiddish, Jewish, Ukrainian, and Russian disciplines. Marietta Borzevich's extraordinary work on the hydropoetics of the Danube, the session with her right now on that topic at the ASEEES this very moment. Their work, to name just a brilliant few, gives me hope that Slavic studies will find a way to receive this knowledge in its full transformative force. Now, whether there will be an American university left standing and in what form to nurture this transformation is a question and a problem for another day for all of us and for future liberation or liberations. But for now, все bude Ukrajina, hladna, vilna I nezaležna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dragan. Our next speaker is Maria Popova, who is an associate professor of political science at McGill University and director of the Jean Monnet Center Montreal. She is the author of Politicized Justice in Emerging Democracies, a study of courts in Russia and Ukraine, published by Cambridge University Press, as well as of articles on judicial reform, the weaponization of law, anti-corruption, conspiracies, and illiberalism, with a focus on Ukraine, Bulgaria, and Eastern Europe more broadly. With Oksana Shevel, our future president who will serve in 2026, Professor Popova co-authored the book Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States, which was recently published by Polity Press. Maria.
Thank you, Vitaly, for this opportunity to think about liberation, which is not a term that we often think about in political science. I think we should at least in comparative politics, we should be doing it more. So let me start with the thought that the events of 1989-91 became coded in the world's imaginary as the collapse of communism. We all know that. As the sudden demise of the Eastern European and Soviet regimes. Like the Berlin Wall, communism broke down from one day to the next and for good. But that's not the only way to interpret the historic juncture. Indeed, the theme of this conference, liberation, could have become the dominant conceptualization. Millions were liberated from dysfunctional communist dictatorships, and in addition, the disbanding of the Warsaw Pact, the Comecon, and the Soviet state suggested that Eastern European satellites and also the Soviet republics were liberated from Russian domination. The choice to conceptualize this era as one of collapse rather than liberation has structured our understanding of the 3 decades that followed, our scholarly priorities, and even our interpretation of the current moment when we, as specialists of the region, are asked to decipher the meaning of Russia's war on Ukraine for a wider audience. I want to argue that the collapse conceptualization was a mistake. It created the misguided impression of irreversibility and an artificial, thick line between the past and the present. It overemphasized the end of communism while largely ignoring Russia's imperial project. The liberation lens would have more accurately captured the arduous, uneven, and slow process of extrication both from state socialism and from Russian imperialism, and also the dangers of reversal and revenge. If we had chosen the liberation lens, images of the Baltic Way protest might have become the iconic images of the end of communism. If we had chosen the liberation lens, we might have seen the Belovezha Accords as Yeltsin's attempt to write new vows for the 3 countries' continued marriage, rather than, as Ukrainian president at the time, Kravchuk, famously put it, a civilized divorce. If we had chosen the liberation lens, we might have looked more critically at the Commonwealth of Independent States as a new vehicle for Russian imperialism rather than take its name really at face value. We might have acknowledged the significance of Yeltsin overshadowing Nazarbayev, the host of the Alma-Ata meeting, which launched the CIS. If we had chosen the liberation lens, we would have understood the separatist and inter-ethnic conflicts in the former Soviet space, from Moldova to Chechnya here on this picture, as Russia's attempt to suppress the liberation process. If we had chosen the liberation lens, we might have understood the economic, this is what I wanted to show next. We might have understood the economic and demographic crises of the 1990s as products of gradual and difficult extrication from the grip of a weakened imperial center, and the wounds as vestiges of the communist regime's economic dysfunction. If we had chosen the liberation lens, we would have better appreciated the exhilarating newfound liberty of the post-authoritarian 90s, the freedom of movement, speech, conscience, assembly, and cultural exchange. And we might have noted earlier that these winds of change vanished alarmingly quickly in Russia. If we had chosen the liberation lens, it would have been obvious to all that Eastern European countries turned to NATO and the EU because they finally had an opportunity to select their own alliances as sovereign states. And no one would have wondered why the Bulgarian foreign minister, pictured here, cried as he watched his country's flag raised at NATO headquarters, a symbol of Bulgaria's return to Europe. Most importantly, we desperately need the liberation lens now. Millions in Ukraine have already lost their liberty to Russian occupation. Millions more, even beyond Ukraine, may yet fall under Russian domination, either through military conquest or at the hands of Russian puppet governments in ostensibly independent states. Europe's citizens writ large may lose democratic liberties as Russian interference accelerates democratic backsliding. If we choose the liberation lens now, we will see that the best parallel for the current moment is 1944-46. At the end of World War II, the US and Western Europe let the Soviet Union take Eastern Europe's sovereignty. Without the consent of Eastern Europeans, the great powers decided that these were to have governments friendly to the USSR. We know how things turned out, through occupation, show trials and executions, deportation, gulags, manipulated elections, crushing of the opposition, and the empowerment of local proxies. The USSR gradually established firm control over Eastern Europe, which lasted the next 45 years. Today, a revanchist Russia attempts a similar grab of Eastern European sovereignty, and again seeks the complicity of Western democracies. Today, we are at a crossroads. Will we avoid or repeat the mistakes of the 1940s? Through the liberation lens, we see Russia clearly as an expansionist empire. We should not allow Russia to manipulate world opinion through the euphemism of security concerns. Russia is in fact attempting to take away others' security and freedom. What Russia aims for isn't influence through soft power, but through the violently enforced loyalty of the Warsaw Pact years. If we use the liberation lens now, we will not repeat the mistake of accepting Russia's demands for friendly governments in the region. Putin wants a friendly Ukraine. What's so bad about that, some ask, even today. Ukrainians understand all too well that a friendly Ukraine means a subjugated one where the Ukrainian language, national identity, and democratic institutions are slowly eradicated. We really need to understand that any attempt by Western leaders to negotiate with Russia above Ukrainians' heads is itself imperialist and unacceptable. If we choose the liberation lens now, we will see that partitioning Ukraine and imposing neutrality on it is the same, in the name of compromise, is really not a solution. Feeding Ukraine's territory and people to Russia piece by piece is not peacemaking, but letting Russia creep to victory. Each day that Ukraine is not in NATO and the EU is another day where Russia's hope to conquer Ukraine stays alive. Only NATO-EU membership, the sovereign choice of overwhelming majority of Ukrainians, can protect Ukraine from repeated Russian aggression. If we choose the liberation lens now, we would see that Russia is seeking to impose its control in countries beyond Ukraine, most recently and clearly in Moldova and Georgia, through election interference, disinformation, oligarchic corruption networks, energy blackmail, local proxies and sympathizers, and military threats. We should recognize that Russia's repeated calls for NATO to roll back its enlargement to 1997 lines reveal its ambition to reestablish dominance all over Eastern Europe. If we choose the liberation lens now, we would understand that if Russia manages to win through force and nuclear blackmail, liberty and democracy all over the world will be in danger as nuclear-armed dictatorships decide to try this promising strategy for themselves. 35 years after 1989, the process of liberation from Russian imperialism is still unfinished. Fearful and indecisive Western leaders are sleepwalking into another betrayal of Eastern Europe and another division of Europe into free sovereign states and Russian-occupied or dominated vassals. It is only Ukraine's heroic resistance and dogged refusal, to use President Zelensky's words, to give our freedom to this effing terrorist Putin that keeps Russian imperialism at bay and protects Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Next is another Maria. Maria Solovetsky is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Music at Bard College. She is the author of the books Wild Music, Sound and Sovereignty in Ukraine, published in 2019, and Vobli do Pлясова станции, published in 2023. She is currently at work on her third book on children's music in Soviet Ukraine. Other notable publications and projects include the album The Chernobyl Songs Project, Living Culture from a Lost World, published by Smithsonian Folkways in 2015, and the multimedia exhibition No Other Home, The Crimean Tatar Repatriates, 2008-2011. Professor Solovetsky is also an accordionist and vocalist who has performed widely throughout Ukraine, Russia, Central and Eastern Europe, and North America.
Thank you. My comments are titled Liberation and Decolonial Vertigo. I grew up in a household that made me skeptical of easy rhetorics of liberation. My family had ended up in North America because they needed to escape along a knife's edge between two powerful eliminationist projects, Nazi extermination on the one side, the Red Army's so-called liberation on the other. I won't ask for a show of hands, but just as a thought experiment. Yes or no, was Poland liberated by the Red Army during World War II? Do we agree that the Soviet invasion of September of 1939 was indeed a, quote, march of liberation, as Putinist historical narrative has demanded in recent years? Or should we wait for 1945 to call it true liberation? If it was liberation in 1945, We can probably agree on what people in those territories were liberated from, but what were those people liberated into? Was the Red Army's liberation contingent upon a new form of subjugation? Who can imagine what a just liberation would have looked like for ordinary people, powerless people in those territories and in those years? Would this contentious history be more settled if liberation were in fact always accompanied by an unambiguously positive moral charge, or if liberation suggested an enduring structure of justice? And just to be honest about where we are today, I might also ask how many of the US citizens in this room consented then or consent now to our government's militarized liberation of Iraq? But we don't need to adjudicate these historical inheritances of World War II or the more recent American past in order to acknowledge how alive they are in the world today, as rhetorics of liberation emanate from above and below, from the mouths of state officials who serve Putin and Putin himself, and from much less powerful elites like us, scholars in the Neoliberal Academy, who search for decolonizing remedies from below, or perhaps more accurately from the middle. In Putin's mouth, the Russian army and its allies today claim to fight to liberate Ukrainians not only from the fever dream of a neo-Nazi regime in Kyiv, but also from its neo-colonial dependence on the West, ostensibly to subjugate it to Russia anew. To the Ukrainian government, liberation may refer to the defeat of the nuclear-armed Russian Goliath, a fight that must be won somehow without escalation and through tragic dependency on a feckless Europe and a cynical and incoherent United States. Which liberation is your liberation if you can only choose one? Whose freedom fighter or terrorist would you choose to advance your liberation struggle? Walter Mignolo, the luminary of decolonial thought, asked us long ago to discard that old Eurocentric Cartesian maxim, "I think, therefore I am," and replace it with his preferred decolonial slogan, "I am where I think." Mignolo is clear that he does not mean that he should think from where he is situated in a private office in one of the wealthiest private universities in the United States, but rather projects himself into the thinking of others he finds sympathetic, from whom he can mine wisdom before translating it into exclusionary language to subvert the, quote, epistemological zero point of Western thought, by which he means the hubristic and universalizing position that masks its, quote, geo-historical body location, end quote. Since 2022, Mignolo has offered little to my explorations of decolonial thought except for implicit support for Putin's war against Ukraine, which he and some of his intellectual allies perceive to be decolonial and liberatory in the grand scheme of things. His argument seems to presuppose that Putin's Russia is interested in, quote, delinking from the colonial matrix of power, and utterly fails to accurately diagnose Russia's neo-imperial threat. As statues and tokens of Russian imperial greatness proliferate throughout the avenues of occupied, or as the Putinists would have it, liberated, Ukrainian cities, as Putinist historical narratives swell with sympathy to patriarchal dictators and emperors of the past and present, as these dictators find intellectual allies not only at home but among theorists here too, one might consider jumping overboard the decolonial ship, if just to make the heaving stop. We are living through an era of decolonial vertigo. The most pronounced symptom to me is intellectual nausea. I think this decolonial vertigo obscures our ability to see ourselves clearly in relationship to ourselves and other selves in the universe, as Wathiongo suggested that liberation should do. What would this authentic, unclouded relational vision yield if we could see beyond the fog of decolonizing slogans mobilized by diametrically opposed camps? For us, as scholars invested in this region and its history and its future, for us as humanists, for us with relative privilege enough to be here in this room right now, what can we do to slow the dizzying effects of this battle of liberatory discourses? I'll share a few remedies that bring occasional, if insufficient, relief to me, with an open invitation to anyone who would like me to help me improve them. The first, to use the case studies from the region we all study to imagine a fairer and less violent future beyond the normative inheritances of the post-World War II and post-Soviet order. 3 anchors assist me in thinking through the Ukrainian case in these terms. The first is Mark von Hagen's 1995 call to consider Ukraine's history in order to challenge the nation-state's conceptual hegemony and to explore some of the most contested issues of identity formation, cultural construction and maintenance, and colonial institutions and structures, end quote. The second comes via the anthropologist Gary Wilder, who in his book Freedom Time points out that thinkers often, quote, treat the meaning of decolonization as self-evident by reducing colonial emancipation to national liberation. Underlying such dyadic accounts is the assumption that European states had empires, but were not themselves empires, end quote. Wilder traces the intellectual history of the poet-politicians Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor between the years 1945 to 1960, assessing how these 20th century intellectuals articulated their visions for a post-imperial order otherwise. Césaire and Senghor both argued for a reconfiguration of the relationship between the French colonies and the French imperial metropole, refigured not as hierarchical, but as equal and interdependent partners, an arrangement that may have impeded the neo-colonial dependencies that followed from this period of decolonization in both Martinique and Senegal. Wilder argues that both men sought to trouble the very stability of the category of France itself. I think we would do well to think about sovereignty and self-determination in our region through frameworks sympathetic to these, to trouble the category of Russia itself, and to lift up thinkers on the periphery who imagine more equitable worlds. To this end, I am also anchored by the ongoing work and struggle of those Ukrainian activists and scholars who live in the uncomfortable gray zones, acknowledging the hegemonies crowding Ukrainians from all sides, who challenge the presumed isomorphism between nation and state, and who do not pretend to have all the answers. Those unwilling to label any acts that are defensive of Ukraine as ethno-nationalistic while upholding the historical fact of Ukraine's multilinguistic, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic pasts and present. I am anchored by those activists who reject the neo-colonial projects of the US and Europe and the terrifying neo-imperialism of Russia. Those who conduct careful materialist analysis and or culturalist analysis without resorting to simplistic interpretations of the Soviet past. I seek intellectual allies that act against the violent epistemologies of purification baked into our political modernity, that name aggression and assess power in real terms, and find ways to defend minority languages, minority cultures, and ways of life that are non-hegemonic, but may teach us important things about not only how to survive, but how to live better together. 2, this is a much shorter point. No matter what happens in the near or distant future in this brutal war with its unimaginable loss of life and physical destruction, I hope that we as scholars will continue to do our part to narrate the Ukrainian fight against 21st century Russian aggression as a courageous reaction to an unjust invasion, and one that all relevant imperial actors predicted would be lost even before it began. Neither the Kremlin nor the Pentagon in the weeks leading up to February 24th, 2022 correctly predicted the future. Nobody did. It was Ukrainians who fought the Russian army back. 3, we must provincialize Russia in our scholarly work and in our institutional homes. We must be attuned to the imperial logics embedded in so much of the world of Slavic studies, from the ways Russian departments attract non-Russian students by over-promising on the exceptional greatness of the language and literature and music, to the ways we teach our classes, to the ways we select and frame our objects of study, to the lazy elision of Soviet and Russian in books, to the way we draft job descriptions and welcome future scholars into the field. And last, 4th, we should find ways to engage in what Olufemi Taiwo, in his diagnostic of the problem of elite capture, calls constructive politics, or a politics of building things. This might mean coming up with shared goals as a society of scholars and then pursuing these goals through practical and material gains. One can imagine goals taking many forms, from the obvious need to improve the Academy's labor practices, the goal of restoring something as basic as dignity and fair compensation for colleagues in the precarious classes of academics, to advocating for more faculty lines in underrepresented fields and more resources to support students who want to pursue those fields. Or perhaps this could be something more directly linked to the epistemological challenge of provincializing Russia by creating more equitably compensated platforms and pipelines for colleagues who productively trouble the very category of Russia. I feel strongly that we must not become sloganeers of liberation, but rather to find ways to live in the epistemic murk that marks this era of decolonial vertigo and to push past its disorienting effects. This means not only imagining liberation from structures of domination, but also building power towards a future liberation grounded in the practical realization of our shared goals, which hopefully align with a vision for a more accurate representation of the past and present, and more clarity on what a just future could look like. I was delighted to learn that a common treatment for vertigo is to perform what are called repositioning maneuvers of the head. Doctors teach patients with vertigo to perform these maneuvers, and then they are empowered to do them at home. I think it is past time that we as a society come up with some repositioning maneuvers of our own, and I'll look forward to continuing that conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And the final speaker on our plenary is Kimberly St. Julian Varnon, who is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Pennsylvania. Her dissertation project traces how Soviet and East German people understood race and blackness. She has become a regular media commentator on the war in Ukraine and on Russian-American relations. Her latest publication, Blackness in the Red Land, African Americans and Racial Identity in the quote-unquote colorless Soviet Union, discusses how visiting and residing in the Soviet Union in the 1930s influenced how a group of African Americans viewed their racial identity. Kimberly, please.
So I don't have much time because I have to liberate myself to my next panel. So there are other worlds than this. I am a shameless Stephen King reader, and that comes from Stephen King and his 7-book tome. And so I'm fascinated by this idea that there are other worlds than this because I think it helps us expand our boundaries. And so my first point before I get into these other worlds is that I ask us to be earnest about liberation. I think it's very easy for us in this room to be cynical about liberation, as many of us have paid $300 a night to be in this room. But I also think that our cynicism about liberation this year, our cynicism about decolonization last year, our cynicism about anti-racism in 2020, I think that cynicism comes from a place of fear, but also from a place of it's much easier to crack jokes than to do the incredibly difficult work that anti-racism, decolonization, see, I can't even pronounce it. Liberation require. And so I think, and I hope that I can help us to start to do this work earnestly, both in terms of our academic work, but in our personal lives, in our lives when we go out of this hotel and interact with other human beings. Because as a historian, that is what I work on, human beings. And I try to remember that. For every person, every name I see in the archive is a person who has lived and who has died. And that person has had meaning to themselves and to other people. And I was struck by a comment that my colleague Nana Aseopari said yesterday in our panel about dispossession. And the opposite of dispossession is not possession, but it's mattering and unforgetting. And I think those two elements, mattering and unforgetting, go to the heart of what liberation is. At least to me in my work, and to me as a Black woman in the United States, to me as a Black woman in an overwhelmingly white field, and as a Black woman who's from Southeast Texas. Unforgetting and mattering are what we do as historians. Otherwise, why are we all in the archive? Oh, economic historians, I know, y'all are different. But that's why I do the work that I do. And so through my work, and particularly in my latest work I presented, it's been recovering, mattering the histories of Black women in Eastern Europe, in East Germany, and in the Soviet Union in particular. But on my panel yesterday, we heard about Afro-Turkish women. We heard about Black women in Serbia, Black women in Yugoslavia, Black women in Albania. And the other worlds than this, to me, means the importance of expanding our intellectual horizons within this field. So often, we are recreating the wheel when we don't have to. As Maria pointed out, we've had a lot of work done on decolonization by thinkers who often are not considered within the world of Slavic and Eastern European studies. But they should be, because they were looking at that picture from 44 to 46 of those European leaders. As Eastern Europe was assigned to Stalin, Southeast Asia and Africa were being reapplied and reassigned to many European countries. Puerto Rico was once again resigned to the United States. So we have a multiplicity of forms of oppression and colonialism and neocolonialism that I think connects many people of our field in Slavic and Eastern European studies to those in the global South. So in many ways, we have to realign our conceptualization of what it means to belong to the first, second, and third worlds. Very few people want to claim third worldship, but what does it mean if we think of Eastern Europe within the third world currently? How does that help us understand the current power structures that place Ukraine at the whim of a Congress in the United States who decides to pause weapons that were promised? So when I think of other worlds, when I think of the Black women that I'm trying to find in archives who do not see them, and why are they not seen? What does it mean to be a person, to have your history told? It can only be told in the archive, and the archive has decided you don't exist. These are questions that African American historians face writing about women who lived through slavery, but it's also a question I faced when I was in Odessa and looking at the Holodomor, and I was told many of those records were either taken by the Soviets or were burned by the Nazis. The erasures, the destruction of the material history that we have, the cultural history that we see in Eastern Europe, it is replicated, and it was replicated in the destruction of Africa, the destruction of Southeast Asia. There are many more things that connect us. Our field, the field of Africana studies, African history, Southeast Asian history, than divide us. Besides languages, because Russian is very difficult, Ukraine is very difficult, I think Arabic is probably difficult. But I think if we think differently about how we present ourselves, how many of you have gone to a conference that isn't Slavic and Eastern European studies? Have gone to German studies, African studies, Southeast Asian studies? We create walls separating ourselves from scholars who are doing work very similar to ours. And I think there are a lot of benefits to this. Not only can we learn from them, but they can learn from us. And I think this comes to some of these problems and conflicts we have now, where people in the field can be so cynical about decolonization because decolonization for Eastern Europeans may not look like or feel like what it does for people in Ghana or Kenya or Indonesia. However, we see now the real implications of when someone sees Russia as a liberating force. What happens and what does that mean when people buy into that history? Because of an ignorance of that history. But what happens for us when we ignore the history of European colonization in the second and third world? It has very real meaning when we say European values, because European values to a Ukrainian or to a German do not mean the same thing to a Namibian or a South African. And so when I think about my job as a historian, I try to build the bridges between these worlds, because to me, they're very similar. And I think we have a lot to learn from each other. But I also think that the cost of continuing to maintain these intellectual walls is entirely too high for the world. And I'll give you an example. I think that we forget the bonds of humanity, and recognition is an important part of that. The unforgetting is an important part of that. But as the second invasion of Ukraine started, I saw Afro-Ukrainians who couldn't get out of Ukraine to go into Poland because their blackness overshadowed their Ukrainianness. I saw Roma individuals who were beaten when they got into Hungary because their Roma overshadowed their Ukrainianness. There are very real life and death impacts of the walls that we create intellectually that go out into popular understandings of belonging. And so when I say there are other worlds, I want to emphasize something that I think many people in the world and the popular culture on Twitter, jitter, whatever we call it now, may not understand. But to me, it's very clear. When we talk about Russian aggression, we focus on Ukraine because it is the latest example of this genocidal violence. But I also want to impress upon you all that the fate of Ukraine is very much tied to the fate of the Central African Republic, where Prigozhin's goons are taking over minds and have done unspeakable crimes to people of Central African Republic, many of which we saw replicated in Ukraine. The types of violence we see against black bodies in Africa done by Russians are similar to the violence we see in Ukraine. The fate of Ukraine, the fate of the Central African Republic, the fate of Syria, they're all tied together. And so what I ask for us to think about is not only are there other worlds than this, but what I'm proposing is that we reframe and retake the meaning of internationalism. Because we know Soviet internationalism often meant to cover up imperialism. But what does it mean if the people of Eastern Europe and the people of Africa and the people of Southeast Asia and the black people of the United States, if we come together to form an internationalism that's multicultural, but also fluid, where we understand each other, we understand the various levels of oppression, and we work towards something greater. So there are, in fact, other worlds than this. And I ask you, in your work, in your lectures, in your teaching, in your syllabi, in your interactions on the Red Line, which is actually closed this weekend, that you remember humanity and you engage earnestly with liberation, meaning unforgetting, but also mattering. That you engage with other people through you matter. Because I think that's one of the most important things we can do as academics, and it gets really easy to forget when you're trying to compile an article or grade papers, is the thing that brought me to Soviet history, is the people. So I ask that you remember that you earnestly engage, and that you explore the other worlds than this. Thank you.
What a brilliant ending. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Thank you so much for all the panelists. It is an honor for me that you've all accepted my invitation, and thank you for the remarks you have contributed. Folks, thank you for being here in the audience. We are out of time for this session. Have the great rest of the conference, and I hope we all inspired to do more good things and more great ideas. I think our presenters today both gave us sobering food for thoughts, but also with the message of how we can do that make that positive difference in the future world. Thank you.